Well, welcome everyone to this Berkeley book chat with Timothy Hampton. I'm Seth Lerer, and I teach at the University of California at San Diego. And I've been friends, collaborators, and colleagues with Tim Hampton for over 30 years. And let me just say what an honor it is to be part of this discussion about Tim's new book on cheerfulness that's just been published by Zone Books. For many of you, Tim needs no introduction. The director of the Townsend Center, a chaired professor of French and Comparative Literature, former chair of French, former chair of Comparative Literature, one of the leading scholars of early modern French literature and culture, and most recently, a scholar of the work of Bob Dylan, whose book on Bob Dylan's poems, it's called Bob Dylan, How the Poems Work, was also published by Zone Books a couple of years ago. Tim and I are going to be talking about his new book, Cheerfulness, which is many things. It is a study of the history of emotion. It is a new look at the Western canon. And in many ways, it's a book also about the challenges of pedagogy and the notion of what we do when we read and teach literature. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to structure this in such a way that Tim and I will have a conversation for about 40 minutes. And I hope that this leaves time for audience question and answer. And while Tim is talking, I will mute myself so that we will avoid any background noise. And so, Tim, welcome. It's an honor. It's a pleasure. You've put on a tie. I feel immensely honored in that. And here's where I want to begin. For someone opening this book for the first time, what is the relationship or what is the difference between cheerfulness and other seemingly comparable forms of human emotion, like happiness or melancholy or joy? Let's start from the history of emotions point of view.
Thank you very much. And first off, thanks to Seth. It really is an honor to have this conversation. And also, before we go any further, I just want to say, since this is the last book chat of the year, I want to offer a shout out to the Townsend Center staff and the ETS staff for their extraordinary work over the past year in putting these book chats on. It's been remarkable, and they've been true heroes, especially the Townsend Center staff, given the fact that we've been driven out of Stevens Hall by construction. So everyone is sort of working on the fly. Okay. So thanks, Seth, and thanks for that first question. So my answer to the question would be, what's the difference between happiness, melancholy, joy, and cheerfulness? So my first question to you, Seth, would be, can you make yourself happy? Make yourself happy, just for now.
I have a unique ability to make myself happy, largely because I have been so disappointed in other people making me happy that I have relied on my own sense of self. So I am a master of the auto-joyful.
The auto-joyful, okay. So the difference that I would argue, and thinking back to classical moral philosophy, is that one of the things that you really that we know one can't do is really make oneself happy. The only person who's happy is, as Sophocles says, is the guy who's happy on his deathbed. So making yourself happy has turned out to be difficult, but you can make yourself cheerful. And we do this every day when we tell each other to cheer up. So one of the things that interests me about cheerfulness was the way in which it seems to be something that lies at least partly in our power. It's a process of self-construal and self-manipulation that we have some control over. We can cheer up, as we tell ourselves to do all the time, and we tell each other to do all the time, often annoyingly. So it was that sense of a kind of control over cheerfulness that I think we don't have over other emotional states. We don't really make ourselves, at least in the traditional discourses on the passions, we don't make ourselves melancholy. black bile may make us melancholy. There may be certain kinds of things that we do that keep us from becoming unmelancholy, but generally speaking, it's not something we have a lot of control over. So it was that sense of having a kind of agency around cheerfulness that seemed interesting to me.
I think that's remarkable. And I think what's so wonderful about it is it dovetails with this almost aphoristic statement in your book when you're talking about Donne and Herbert and the 17th century. You have a line, cheerful community is linguistic.
Yeah.
Develop that.
Oh, thank you. Okay. Well, there are sort of two exciting moments for me working on the early modern period. One is when I discovered that in the King James Bible, there are multiple passages across the New Testament that have nothing to do with each other, linguistically speaking, in Greek or in Latin. Phrases about linguistic performances or sort of affective engagements that are described with different phrases in Latin or in Greek. They simply have nothing to do with each other. When they're translated into English in the King James Bible, they're all described with the language of cheerfulness. So Jesus appears to the disciples at the end of the book of John, and he says, in Latin, he says, confidite, have confidence or believe or have faith. In English version, he says, cheer up, or be of good cheer, right? So that's got those, and then there are later moments where Paul gives speeches in a cheerful manner. So he's doing what Jesus told him to do, except Jesus didn't tell him to do that in Greek, and he didn't tell him to do it in Latin either. So that politics of translation seemed to me was simply an astonishing discovery and since cheerfulness is connected to the idea of community and to the representation of community, it meant that in effect the King James Bible translators were constructing a kind of new Christian community around cheerfulness through a kind of violence of translation, really. So that was the first moment that struck me as being really interesting. The second moment that struck me, which is the one that you referred to in the discussion of John Donne, is there's this wonderful moment where in one of his sermons where Donne talks about the Bible, and he says, God has given us his message in cheerful forms, through the Psalms in particular. He says the Psalms are cheerful. Now, I'm not sure what uncheerful forms would be. I mean, I guess maybe tragedy or something. But Donne says he's given us the good news through cheerful forms and through a kind of cheerful language. The language of the Psalms is cheerful. And so and he says is cheerful and energetic. So there's a sense in which the energy of the emotional life and the energeia of rhetorical style dovetail perfectly for Donne. That was a really striking moment for me, right? So that cheerfulness becomes a form of style. It becomes an aesthetic issue, which of course it already was for the troubadours who talk about the famous gai saber and the idea that gaiety generates poetry, but it also becomes again then thematically in a major kind of way for people like Emerson and later Nietzsche, right? Where, Nietzsche talks again and again and again about his cheerful style, right? So I thought that the idea that the moment that cheerfulness dovetails with, becomes an aesthetic choice, seemed also very interesting to me.
Can we identify aspects of the cheerful style?
Well, Nietzsche says that it lies in the surface of art. I mean, the famous descriptions that Nietzsche gives us in Nietzsche contra Wagner of a kind of Mediterraneanized art, not deep art, which is depressing art, which is German art, but a kind of superficial light art, the art that, as he says, in the fold, in the surface, in the note. Those are some of the last words that he writes actually before he goes bonkers in Nietzsche contra Wagner. He says, I want an art that is defined by cheerfulness, Heiterkeit. He says any cheerfulness but a cheerfulness, and that there's that sense of a kind of light, playful style that Nietzsche targets so dramatically. But that also points back to what Emerson talks about in his essay on Shakespeare, where he says that when he's talking about the poet, he says the poet Shakespeare is characterized by two things. One is his lack of ego. There's no sense, we can't find Shakespeare in his works. And the other is his cheerfulness. And he says cheerfulness is what all great poets have. And it casts light over creation, says Emerson. I mean, it's one of these Emersonian phrases. You have no idea what the hell he's talking about. But Nietzsche then goes on and tries to make that more specific and says, yeah, it's in the medium of art. Cheerfulness lies in the surface of the text, in the medium of the text. And in the book, I try and sort of move from there to a reading of William Butler Yeats's 1937 poem "Lapis Lazuli," which has these extraordinary lines where he's talking about it's about poetry and tragedy, and he says all things fall and are built again, and those who build them again are gay. And he gives us the great image of the three Chinamen carved on the piece of lapis lazuli who are looking down on the catastrophe of history with their wrinkled eyes, sort of transmitting a certain kind of transcendent cheerfulness. I mean, that's Yeats's application of Nietzsche, but I would argue that it goes all the way back, and that there's a whole tradition. This is one of the things that the book wanted to do, was to kind of write a history or sketch out a history of a certain kind of cheerful aesthetic that runs through the Western canon, whatever that would be. Runs through a certain Western canon, which I've now invented, obviously, and that is not a certain tradition that we've been accustomed to think about, which is the Albrecht Dürer tradition that argues that all art comes out of melancholy and the artist is the melancholic figure. Certainly Emerson doesn't believe that, and Nietzsche doesn't believe it, and the troubadours don't believe it, and John Donne doesn't believe it. So I don't know whether I believe it, but
I think that's great. I have many questions. Here's where I want to go. In this narrative, then, does cheerfulness function as a kind of secular salvation? In other words, is the idea of cheerfulness doing the work of what words like salvation or redemption would do in a theological vocabulary?
That's a great question. Sure. That should solve it right there, right? Sure, why not? I think certainly to an extent. I think that, so I would tend to think of it less in terms of those sort of metaphysical words than I would think of it in terms of the kind of ethics of Christian community. Because the key moment in the Bible, at least for me, where cheerfulness really plays an important role is in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, where he says, we should all members of the Christian community, and we should all give gladly, not of necessity, for God loveth a cheerful giver. That's the Geneva Bible and the King James phrase. So there's a sense that cheerfulness in that regard is linked to a certain Christian tradition of sort of charitable practice, and which is bound up with a certain participation in community. That seems interesting to me, to the extent that can replace those big words like salvation and redemption. I mean, there's a big discussion to be made around that, isn't there? About, I mean, that's in some way the problem of modern art. To what extent it can save us from the fact that God is dead. I mean, Nietzsche seems to think it can, but he was crazy. So what do I know?
But I mean, you understand the thrust of this is that your book is in many ways I think it is a secular book in this sense, in that it is looking to construct not just a canon of literary texts, but really an ideal of cultivated being.
Yeah.
And in a sense, cheerfulness, is a consequence of what used to be called Bildung, let's say, right?
Yeah.
Which in itself was a carefully curated, secularized form of growth and education that was explicitly designed to how can I put it, to bring communities into political and social belonging who had been excluded because of their heterodoxy, or because of their orthodoxy, or because of,
Right. So I would not have thought of it in terms of Bildung, but certainly Kant has a text on pedagogy where he speaks about cheerfulness in the same kind of language as Bildung, and he's very interested in education as a kind of religious education, a kind of moral and religious education. So I think that's right. I had not thought about it in the context of Bildung, mainly because I didn't want to write that history. And what I was interested in around cheerfulness was, in fact, as one gets into the 19th century, but already in Shakespeare, the limitations of cheerfulness and the way in which cheerfulness is, people who write about cheerfulness are constantly thinking about the kind of edges of the communities that are being proposed. I mean, the version of Bildung that you just gave us was a very finely wrought one, because it raised the issue of, as you call it, the bringing into conversation of previously marginalized communities. The extent to which that happens or doesn't happen is, of course, extremely problematic. The extent to which Bildung is a kind of universalizing ideal or not is, of course, a very fraught question. Where I think cheerfulness is useful is that it is constantly thinking about those processes of appropriation or bringing into a larger conversation certain subjects, certain communities, and also thinking about the limits of what it can do, or at least the people who write about cheerfulness seem to be able to think about the limits of what cheerfulness also can do and what cheerful community would do, right? I mean, there are moments in the Enlightenment when people like Hume and Adam Smith are very keen on cheerfulness as a characteristic of a kind of enlightened conversation among philosophers, right? And they don't have any idea. I mean, they never acknowledge the fact that there are no women and there are no people of color and whatever, right? But when you get into the 19th century, people become much more aware of the fact that it's gendered, it's racialized, and so on and so forth. But I mean, I think that's right. I think thinking about cheerfulness in the context of Bildung is not an unreasonable thing to do.
I think one of the things that strikes me as I reread the book is how much it is about community building, therefore.
Yeah.
And this is not a question of making yourself happy or making yourself
It's not.
cheerful.
Yeah.
It is a question of belonging.
Yeah. I think that's right. And it was one of the surprises in working on the book, because when I got started working on it, I thought it was going to be all about a certain kind of performance and a certain kind of passing, even. It's about making yourself a particular kind of way. But then I realized that as people wrote about it, they always wrote about it in these kind of communal contexts, and that cheerfulness is something that sort of flashes up between us, right? It's something that that has an impact on the interior of the self, but it flashes up between us, which means that it is bigger than us. It is a communal phenomenon that structures communities in many cases, and that sort of zooms around. And this is where actually David Hume is very useful, because he calls it a contagion or a flame. He says, there are a bunch of people standing around and they're really bummed out because, whatever, there's a war in Ukraine, and or they've, the Mets have lost the series or whatever, and a cheerful person comes in, and cheerfulness sort of takes over the company, and it sort of zooms around. So it's bigger than we are. It envelops us, and that was something I had no expectation that I would come up with find that kind of language, and I found it again and again and again across historical periods, whether it be Christianized in the case of commentaries on Paul's letter to the Corinthians, or whether it be a kind of Enlightenment philosophical concept in the work of people like Hume and Smith.
One question then that emerges from this side of the discussion, and that is part of the work on the Romantics, is the relationship between nature and cheerfulness. In other words, can an engagement with the natural world make you cheerful? Is cheerfulness do you hear it in the songs of birds, or is there a poetry of cheerfulness? Is this something that Nietzsche would say is really just superficial and Mediterranean, or is it something deeper?
Yeah. That's a really great question. And one of the challenges in writing the book was that I wanted to think a lot about lyric poetry and cheerfulness, because I've spent a lot of time reading the troubadours of the 12th century, and they always talk about gaiety, the gayness of the spring. And I mean, it's not only the troubadours doing it in Occitan, it's the Dolce Stil Nuovo poets in Italy. Guido Cavalcanti writes about the gaiety of the spring and the way in which that natural phenomenon, first of all, inspires love in us and also inspires poetry in us. And that's a cliche that runs certainly up to the 16th and 17th century, as you know. Ronsard says to his girlfriend, "Get up and listen to the gay alouette singing its song," right? So there's that kind of sense that it's gaiety, which is the feature of nature that can, first of all, inspire love and also inspire poetry. And one of the things that I found out moving to think about the Romantics is that there's it becomes a weirdly deceptive phenomenon. It becomes sort of prosthetic or artificial forms of cheer get in the way of making correct moral choices, right? I mean, a good example is, or making the right choice. A good example is in Book 5 of Paradise Lost, which that's not the Romantics, I realize, but where Eve wakes up from her dream and she's dreaming of the apple, and Adam thinks that she feels guilty, and it's actually, she's thinking about how great that dream was, and Milton says, and Adam cheered her up, and she was cheered. And then they go out into the fields, and this is the moment where Adam is completely blown it, because he doesn't realize that Eve is actually thinking about something else. And so cheerfulness becomes a kind of distraction that gets in the way. And we find that again. I tracked that moment into some poems by Wordsworth, where there's a kind of mistaken cheerfulness, where somebody says, "Okay, well, let's just cheer up." And the minute somebody says, "Okay, let's just cheer up," you know that the wrong decision has been made, and that, we're going to lose the farm, or the French are going to invade, or something bad is going to happen, because cheerfulness becomes a kind of distraction, right? So that connection between poetry and cheerfulness becomes somewhat dangerous as we move into the 19th century. It's a cliche for the Renaissance, but for the 19th century, it's a cliche, but it becomes dangerous in the 19th century in a way that it wasn't earlier, I think.
Would you be prepared to say that cheerfulness is the way in which we cope with the post-lapsarian condition?
Yeah, it could be. Yes, I'm not sure I want to become that grandly philosophical, but I mean, that's certainly what Nietzsche says. I mean, Nietzsche says, in the Gay Science, he says, well, God's dead. Okay, so there's a cheerfulness connected with that. And he says, and the sea has never seemed as clear as it's ever been before, and the sun has never seemed as bright, and the water has never seemed as smooth, and we can set out on our voyage. I mean, it becomes a kind of Odyssean like voyage, and sort of this kind of epic voyage, which sort of takes over because now God is dead. And so that cheerful Nietzschean response is the answer to the death of God. So that might be one way to think about it.
Tim, as we're having this conversation, anyone listening in will recognize that your talents as a teacher are clearly evident. And the Cheerfulness book is very much, as you suggested, a book with a strong pedagogical sense. And I want you to take off on that, because I'd like you to talk about not just what's pedagogical about the book, but the way in which there's a clear relationship, because I know you personally, there's a clear relationship between the interest, the approach, and the voice of this book, and what I know to be your classroom and your public voice.
Well, that's a very perceptive comment. Thank you for that. Yes, I think that from thinking about cheerfulness, I'm sort of groping around here to figure out how to formulate that. I am very interested in what art does that other things don't do, that other kinds of writing don't do. And in fact, that's been one of the characteristics of really all of my scholarship. What is it that literary texts do that historiography doesn't do? How can literary text represent events in a way that historiography doesn't? Or how can literary representations of diplomacy, to evoke an earlier book that I wrote, do something that other writing about diplomacy doesn't? So I've always been interested in the kind of mysterious nature of the aesthetic object, and what Adorno calls the law of form, the kind of power that comes through the aesthetic structure. So cheerfulness connects up to that sense of trying to find the power of art in the present, and I'm indebted to the kind of thinking that I do find in writers like Shakespeare and Rabelais, who speaks again and again about the importance of what he calls reading things in the best sense, a certain kind of what used to be called hermeneutics of faith, though I would never put it in those kind of metaphysical terms, but the sense that art can bring certain kinds of things to us in the present if we listen carefully to the past. And that is, as far as I can see, what we should be doing in the university. I mean, certainly that's not to say to read naively or uncritically, but that we should be looking for the grounds for community and the grounds for commonality in the texts that we read in the past. That seems to me to be the only reason to do this. Otherwise, we should, go get a real job, I would think. So I think cheerfulness is connected to pedagogy in a strange way.
Let me push it a little bit.
I sense you have some, something that the fox knows one thing here that he's going to reveal. So
no, really, this is a book that not only makes a case for a particular canon, it makes a case for the idea of the canon. It makes a case for canonicity. And to speak personally, my experience was I spent over 30 years in exceedingly canonical, traditional national literature departments at universities of a kind where the teaching and the sort of public work of the humanities was largely supplemental. And was wrapped up in notions of value or wrapped up in notions of character in these kinds of ways. And for the past dozen years, I've been at a University of California campus, a very large, diverse first-gen campus, but one that's almost unique in that, along with Santa Cruz, we have one large literature department. And so part of my challenge is, how do I come from a very canonical background in all senses of that word and teach, even if I'm teaching texts that look canonical, teach them in an institutional structure and to a student body that is anywhere from unknowing to suspicious of the canon.
Yeah.
And all I'm trying to say is that working through your book is helping me figure that out.
Yeah. Well, that's a very helpful observation. And I have to say, I had a similar experience after having been a graduate student at Princeton, which is where we first met, and working in a kind of fairly traditional kind of great books, Western civ, epic, tragedy, whatever tradition, and then having taught briefly at Yale, I still remember the kind of terror and excitement of coming to Berkeley and seeing my first classes of undergraduates from these amazing backgrounds from all over the world, and realizing that even though I myself had not come from a kind of Western Civ canonical background, since I was raised in the Rockies, and I got nothing in common with Homer, I can tell you that much, even less with Dante. But still, for certain kinds of reasons, cultural reasons, racial reasons, whatever, feeling I had some kind of connection, or at least desire for that kind of Western canon. Coming to Berkeley and seeing students who came from backgrounds that were just astonishingly different from mine, and so interesting and rich in their own ways, and realizing that whatever I taught could never be taken for granted. That it was never assumed, it should never be assumed that any of my students would want to read any of the books I would want them to read. So, and I had to have a reason, I had to figure out for myself why those books mattered. And they didn't matter just because they were in the Penguin Classics, or because, Joe Schmo said to read them, or Eric Auerbach wrote about them. There needed to be a reason from the inside out as to why we should read those books. And, so then you have the experience of teaching a play by Corneille to, a Filipino-American student who comes to me and says, the story of Le Cid, which is a story about parental jealousy and arranged marriage, is the story of my grandparents. And you say, oh my God, yes, okay. So that's where you discover the kind of commonalities that literary and the kind of communities that literary texts can generate around themselves. And that's certainly something I've tried to work on as I've been here. And I've tried to think about, in my work on Rabelais in particular, about the limits of community and the edges of community, and the way in which a humanist writer may talk about a happy community of readers, but we know that there are no Turks in that community, and we know that there are no women in that community, and we know that there are certain other kinds of people who are beaten up and beaten down as soon as they get close to the community. So cheerfulness does bring together a whole series of themes that I've been thinking about in my teaching, and that I know you've struggled with as well, which is, why do we read this stuff, and how does it connect up to what we do when we work with our students, and what our students do when they read and they learn to read and learn to write, and we try and work with them as they learn to read and write.
This is a book that I think was put together and certainly appears during a period of time when there are unique challenges, right? We have medical challenges, we have the pandemic, we've been through quarantine, there are political challenges, there's all kinds of, stuff going on, when cheer up is just not going to be enough. And I'm wondering about the way in which you end the book with the question of what you call cheer in pandemic days. Yeah. And sort of not just the book as a pandemic book, but where does the book look forward to? What can we use, as it were, proleptically to get us to?
So I should say the end of the book, even though Seth and I have been talking about a lot of sort of highfalutin canonical writers in a certain basically mostly Anglo-American or Franco-Anglo-American tradition, the book ends with a couple of chapters on 20th century American culture. There's a chapter that's about Norman Vincent Peale and the Boy Scouts and the kind of Yankee tradition, and also the invention of Cheerios, and the Yankee tradition of a kind of upbeat commercialization of cheerfulness, and the ways in which the idea of cheerfulness is sort of ripped away from the communitarian contexts in which it claims authority, whether it be in the Reformation or whether it be in the Enlightenment or whether it be in the Romantic period, and so on. But you're right, Seth. I mean, we're living in strange times. Donald Trump called himself a cheerleader for America when he went on TV to promote various kinds of ineffective medications against the pandemic. So one of the things that I thought about in the conclusion to the book was what cheerfulness can do and what it can't do. So you can't build a politics on cheerfulness, right? Barack Obama was elected president on with a single word: hope, right? You know, if I run for president, if I run for president of the UC Berkeley Senate faculty and say cheer, that's my platform, I will get no votes, not even my own. And so you can't build a politics on cheerfulness, but it is a kind of resource, and that's what I wanted to kind of think about. And really, that comes out of partly it's biographical. I mean, when I was much younger, very much younger, and as a child, actually, I lived in close proximity to people who for various health reasons, just could barely make it through the day. They just, every day was a struggle. They were in pain, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it's not a very interesting story, but to have lived next to in close proximity to people for whom making it through the day was a major challenge, you realize at a certain point that cheerfulness is a sort of technology of the self, as Foucault would say. It's a tool, it's a resource. And so I think in the moment of the pandemic, it might be worth thinking about that resource. As debased and commercialized and phony as much of our cheer is, it's still also something that's worth thinking about. And that's what I kind of wanted to do. I wanted to kind of rescue a certain tradition of thinking about the cheerful that I was not expecting to find, by the way, when I got into this. I had no idea that if you read David Copperfield, you'll find that Dickens is using the word cheer in very, very specific ways. And there are moments when it disappears from the text for 200 pages and reappears and so on and so forth. But that in the current moment, it might be worth thinking about that tradition. And one of the things that struck me was the way in which the language of cheerfulness from the 15th century to the present is remarkably stable. And, you know, whether my cheer and Julian of Norwich's cheer is the same cheer, I doubt, but the language is pretty much the same. And so that suggests that there is a kind of tradition of a sort of cheerful reflection. And I wanted to see if I could rescue that tradition and give it some kind of shape and tell its story, which was the challenge, obviously.
That is the challenge. And, you know, the book does it brilliantly well. We're getting some questions on the chat, but I cannot resist, medievalist that I am. I'm going to offer another example that may challenge things. There's a wonderful moment in Beowulf, which is as pre-modern a text as anybody would want, when the counselor Wulfgar turns to Hrothgar, the king. Beowulf and his retinue have just shown up, and Hrothgar is debating among his counselors how to treat these people. And Wulfgar, his counselor, calls him Gladman Hrothgar, transparental Gladman Hrothgar. Now, this is what Anglo-Saxons love to call a hapax legomenon. The word doesn't appear anywhere else except in a glossary of Anglo-Saxon, of Old English and Latin words, where Gladman glosses hilaris. And that is the Latin word in St. Paul.
Yeah.
And so that to me is a moment of wonderful pre-modern cheer,
yes.
If you will. Because it's very clear that what you're talking about is not, this is not a book about the invention of modernity.
Right.
This is a book that is very much, I think, about a deep legacy in the Western tradition. Yeah. And it is, the work you did in biblical narrative is very much a legacy of a certain kind of Pauline social theology.
Yeah.
A way of being in a community, a way of leading, a way of ruling. And it always comes back to that. And I think being a cheerleader for America, with the idea of, Cheerios as our sort of secular Eucharist now, that instead of the wine and wafer, we have the oat and O and the milk every morning, is a kind of communion. Yes. In that root sense.
Yes.
There is a question in the chat now. How did writing the book affect your own ability to be cheerful?
Before we get to that question, though, let me ask the question. So I'm just reminded of the moment in the Woody Allen movie Hannah and Her Sisters, where Woody Allen's girlfriend, I think, or one of his girlfriends is taking some extension classes at Columbia, and he says, "Whatever you do, don't take a class where they make you read Beowulf." So it's my own fault for not having gone there. But you're right. No, I mean there is this sense of hilaritas. And I have to say that one of the fun things and one of the challenging things about writing the book was getting the language down, right? So cheer is connected to an old word meaning face. And we think of the Latin word or the Spanish word cara, right? They're all the same terms. But the French speak of gaiety, the Germans speak of Heiterkeit or Fröhlichkeit, and there's the Latin word hilaritas. There's also the word alacritas, which is a word that Erasmus likes to use a lot. And there's a whole sort of word cloud of terms that I tried to kind of bounce back and forth or bounce around in as I was kind of spinning my story. Curiously enough, I was never taken into the territory where I actually have some academic training, which is the study of the Romance languages, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese. The same resonances don't seem to pertain there linguistically, which is not to say there aren't cheerful Spanish people. I mean, there must be, but there's not a reflection on it that I was able to find in the literature. And that could just be my shortcomings. Also, that of course it's a Western tradition and a Western project. And I spent a lot of time talking to my colleague Michael Nyland in the history department at Berkeley, who's a very distinguished scholar of medieval China, and she's actually written essays on this about how there is no language of cheerfulness in the Chinese tradition, which is not to say there aren't cheerful Chinese people, but there's no sort of reflection on it. And so I worked with her. I worked with another friend who works on South Asian issues to sort of make sure that I wasn't getting too far out of my range by only focusing, on these particular texts. Okay, how did writing the book affect my own sense of cheerfulness? It certainly gave me, I can't say that I'm any more cheerful now or any less cheerful or any less depressed than I was at the beginning. But I do think that I have a sense of the kind of stakes of cheerfulness, and that's a good thing. And I do think that I have a sense of the limitations of cheerfulness and what's involved in it, in thinking about it. And so, it's like, as I say, it's a resource, and it's like learning anything else. It's like learning to play the piano. Learning to think about cheerfulness is something that's going to sort of teach you about the kind of mechanisms of emotional life. And I think in that sense, it was a rewarding process. I can't say that I'm any less of an Eeyore than I've ever been, but yeah.
I think it's natural for us to assume that there is a relationship, and I'm just building on the implications of that question.
Yeah.
That there's a relationship between our scholarly and intellectual work on the one hand,
yeah,
and our emotional state on the other.
Yes. Yeah.
And I just want to throw out the idea of whether or not this is this one of those features of or self-mythologies of academic life,
yeah,
that we want to crack open.
Well, I don't know. I don't know that it's a mythology. There are times when I feel that everything I've ever written is shamelessly autobiographical. One could track it back. One could track my dissertation back to what I was doing as a graduate student in Princeton and feeling like an outsider as a working class kid from a public university who had somehow ended up at Princeton. And I needed to think about ways of self-fashioning. So I wrote a book about Renaissance we didn't use the word self-fashioning back. I didn't use the word self-fashioning back then, but about the way in which Renaissance actors constructed themselves by reading history. So, I mean, one could argue that that's an embarrassing piece of autobiography. It certainly feels like it now. Yeah, I'm not. I think I might push back a little bit and say that we certainly are invested to some extent in various mediated ways. I mean, some people, especially in the current moment, take that autobiographical impulse very, very seriously and write pieces of literary criticism that are, in fact, sort of shamelessly autobiographical, right? Jane Tompkins was a famous example if we used to do that.
I've done that.
Yeah, you've done that.
Shamelessly.
I don't know that you've done that.
Well, I think
you've written a memoir, but that's a little bit different.
I agree with you that there is an autobiographical narrative. I think I think this is this is where I'm going, and this is where we're going to wrap up because we have only 10 minutes left.
Yes.
And that is that what I see, interestingly, in my own students is the way in which when I teach cultural criticism or literary theory, they have a sort of almost intuitive relationship to Lauren Berlant's notion of cruel optimism, which is a book that surfaces at the end of your book.
Yeah.
And while it's not unfair to say that no one can give me a clear paraphrase of what that book is about, everyone can feel something in it that speaks to the contemporary moment and that also invites in their own work a certain kind of, if not autobiographical, auto-emotional response, if you see what I'm going for.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And I want to end our conversation not by just simply saying your book is, the happy response to cruel optimism, but as a way of sort of saying that the book is of a piece with a particular scholarly and critical move right.
I think that's right. And actually, what's interesting about the book is that it was not supposed to be the book it's ended up being. I had written a very erudite, footnote-heavy book about the history of diplomacy, and I wanted to write something light. And I had that actually the model for the book was Harry Frankfurt's book on bullshit. And I thought I could write a kind of speculative essay on cheerfulness, because I was just thinking about it as a kind of concept, because I had stumbled across the word in a couple of texts. And so this was going to be, a 100-page text of my witty and wise reflections on cheerfulness. And so I started reading around and saying, okay, where would you go if you wanted to find somebody who had talked about cheerfulness? Well, you would go look at the Bible. You would go look at Shakespeare. You would go look at Dickens. And I found out, to my astonishment, that all of these people were thinking very deeply about cheerfulness. And it became an element in not only in asides and commentaries in their text, but also in the generation of the plot itself. Right? I mean, in David Copperfield, everybody at some point has to be brought to cheerfulness. Everyone starts out. Agnes Wickfield starts out tranquil, and by the end of the novel, we're told from that moment on, she was cheerful every day, right? So there's a kind of conversion to cheerfulness in Dickens. I mean, I had no sense of this. So after I had read all of this stuff, I found that I had to write not a witty 80-page essay on cheerfulness, but a history that tracked it through a whole series of different things. So it ended up being, a much more of a labor than I thought it would be. But as you say, it is of a moment, it is of a piece with a particular moment in writing about culture at the present time, that I sort of refract through my own interests and approaches, which tend to be historical and tend to be connected to the literary or the musical increasingly, rather than beginning with a sentence in Heidegger and going from there. I mean, that's not the way I work, and that's just the way I work. That's just it. That's all I can do.
We do have time. One more question came in on the chat, and I'd like to throw it out, and that is, let's talk about gender and cheerfulness.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about in terms of the male canon, in terms of gender response?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, great question. And we can also talk about race and cheerfulness. And I should say that the book has a chapter on Louis Armstrong and W.E.B. Du Bois, which is about the kind of misperception of Black performance as a cheery thing, right? So, and that was really, I shared some of the work in the Townsend Center with my colleagues, and my colleague Cecil Giscombe from the English department said to me, you really need to be thinking about Black performance and cheerfulness. And so then I went and read all the stuff, and I thought, oh my God, of course. So that was incredibly helpful. Thank you to Cecil and to the Townsend Center. The question of gender,
a wonderful piece on the railroad.
Yeah,
that I saw. Right.
Yeah.
Great. Right.
So the question of gender is very important, and I got onto that much earlier than I did thinking in terms of race, because there's stuff in the Middle Ages where women are cheerful. Women are supposed to be cheerful, and that's part of your job. And so I figured I should go right to the center of things. So I read all of Jane Austen, and boy, it's all over the place. So in the very first Jane Austen novel, Sense and Sensibility, on the very second page, we're told that Mrs. Dashwood was so cheerful that in cheery times she was out of control cheerful, with such exuberance, thinking about about that cheer that is its own reward and also the promise of its own reward. And what happens in the novel, of course, is that Eleanor Dashwood has nothing to do with this. She's totally skeptical, but Mary Ann Dashwood goes through a kind of personal crisis where she's duped by the evil John Willoughby. And the novel tells us at one point that everything Mary Ann is trying to do is to get back to cheer. There's an Austen sentence where she says every sentence aimed at cheerfulness, right? And so there is really a sense that cheerfulness is the default version for a particular female subjectivity. So I read some handbooks and guidebooks of education written by people in the late 18th and early 19th century for young women, and that's what they all say. Your job as a young woman is to be cheerful and to get married and then be cheerful as married and so on and so forth. So it really is heavily, heavily gendered, which is why it's so wonderful that Shakespeare begins A Midsummer Night's Dream with Theseus humiliating Hermia and then turning in the very next line to Hippolyta, the Amazon queen, and saying, "What cheer, my love?" And it's like Hippolyta is going, "What? What have I got myself into?" So I think that even from Shakespeare on, people have been thinking about the limits of cheerfulness and the way in which it is a kind of civilizing force. I mean, Theseus can be cheerful because he's the Duke of Athens. Of course he can be cheerful, right? And so it is connected up. I mean, now this goes back to what you were saying earlier about Bildung and education. It is, at least for Shakespeare in A Midsummer Night's Dream, there's a sense that we're all going to be educated and made cheerful by learning how to respond to the story of Pyramus and Thisbe as the working men put it on, and so on and so forth. And Hippolyta, who's the outsider, says, "This is the stupidest thing I've ever seen in my life. I have no use for this stuff." So she's the figure who says, "Sorry, I won't be civilized." And it's deeply gendered.
I think that's wonderful. And I think that that's a wonderful way of wrapping up because, in a way, this is a book about civilization. It's a book about culture. It's a book about emotion. It's a book about the self. But I think that for anyone interested in not just literature and cultural theory, but sort of the way in which academic writing is being done at its best. Cheerfulness by Timothy Hampton, Zone Books, 2022, is a wonderful introduction to a way of thinking, and not just a way of thinking, but a way of being. So we're coming up on 1 o'clock now. I want to thank Tim for this wonderful conversation. I want to thank the staff of the Townsend Center for facilitating and hosting this fantastic conversation. And I want to thank the University of California for making it possible for people like Tim, like me, like the Townsend Center, and like all of you who are probably listening, to be aware of just how much the life of the mind impacts on our everyday experience in society. Tim, thanks a million.
Thanks,
Thank you very
Seth.
much to everyone in the Townsend Center, and thank you all for listening in.